Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Introduction to Criminal Justice. Today, we're discussing the business of the court, specifically post-trial, dealing with sentencing and appeals. So, when we think of sentencing, we have 5 really philosophical principles that guide our decision in sentencing someone, right? Now, no one is wholly in one category or another. Generally speaking, we tend to be retributive and deterrence-based in terms of the American system, and other systems take different approaches. All right, so let's break this down by looking at the philosophical principles. The first is retribution. So retribution can be traced back to the Code of Hammurabi. Remember, that's the oldest known legal code to exist. And it had a prescription for lex talionis, which literally translates to an eye for an eye. So for retribution, it provides that punishment is the just deserts of a transgression. So basically, society is obligated to punish. But under retribution, the punishment can't be greater than the harm, right? An eye for an eye, not an eye and a tooth for an eye for an eye. So we are limited by proportionality. So we basically decide to do what is comparable to you, what you did to somebody else, but we cannot go above that. Right, so this would be, there was a really big controversy, and this happened only a couple decades ago, when most states prescribed the death penalty for rape, and it got to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said no, it has to be a homicide offense, and a lot of people got upset, but they were using the retributive approach, right? Of this person is going to be in prison for a very long time to kind of make up for what they did, but putting them to death, that actually kind of does disservice to the victim, right? Because we're saying, well, we're putting him to death because it has to be proportionate and you're basically dead. Like, we don't want to send that message. So that is where retribution stands, right? It's one of the foundations of American sentencing philosophy. It's one of really 2. The next type of philosophy, or the next philosophy, I should say, that we look at is deterrence. Now, deterrence is interesting because it's predicated on rationality. Right? So deterrence seeks to prevent future crimes. We'll get into it in a second, but as you're probably thinking, not all crimes can be deterred, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. So that being said, under deterrence, we say there are 2 types of deterrence. There's general deterrence and there's specific deterrence. For specific deterrence, we are trying to make sure that that single individual offender does not reoffend. They are deterred from reoffending. In terms of general deterrence, we basically put that offender on a pedestal and show society what happens if you break the law. So we are theoretically showing this person off to keep others from breaking the law, right? So general deterrence is others, specific deterrence is the individual. Now, how deterrence works is interesting, because there's a lot of scholarship and most of it focuses on 3 areas to be considered an effective deterrent. So an effective deterrent needs to the severity of the punishment, right? So the punishment has to be severe enough to deter the individual and the general public. There's no prohibition on going over proportionality here, right? So it's whatever it takes, and that's really the motto, is whatever it takes to affect specific and general deterrence. Then we have certainty of punishment, right? So not only will you get punished for committing an offense, but you know exactly what's going to happen to you for committing that offense, right? You know you're going to go to jail for 25 years, or you know you're going to get probation. And then finally, the swiftness of punishment, right? So punishment should, to be most effective, occur as soon as the person is sentenced, right? To be the most effective. So swiftness really comes into play. Now, if we look at these three factors for talking about the American system, right? The American system is a mix of retribution and deterrence. But when we think about the three factors, severity of punishment has been an interesting factor, because we have gotten less severe on certain crimes and more severe on certain crimes. And it hasn't really changed proportionality at all, or excuse me, how much crime rates of that crime occur. So it isn't actually as big of a deal as you would think, because, and we see this like before the French Revolution, and we see this in early America, right? Like the penalty for any felony was death. Well, okay, right? Like at some point you're probably going to commit a felony, and just it is what it is. So the idea here is we want to make it as severe as possible so the individual and that the general public do not commit another crime. Now, again, if you just jumped to the death penalty for everything, it is a great specific deterrence, right? Because that individual can never offend again. They're dead. But in terms of general deterrence, we've actually seen a reverse system. What this means is, because the death penalty is considered a brutal tactic, right? It's the most severe thing. We are taking somebody's life away. So that's the state saying this person is not deserving of life. And what we've seen is in states that retain the death penalty, crime, and especially violent crime, has risen, while crime in the rest of the United States, where there's no death penalty, has fallen. Right? So we are asking, is it because people think the state values human life less? What's going on here? All right, so it's an interesting question. Certainty of punishment. We'll talk about mandatory minimum sentencing and all of that lovely jazz. But for a long time, judges had a wide range of discretion, right? They could sentence you to anything, virtually. The legislature prescribed certain rules, like a minimum of this many years, maximum of this many years. And then the judge could pick anything in between. And then we have the US Sentencing Commission is created, and they create guidelines. And now it becomes a mathematical equation. And we'll look at what the equation looks like in determining how many years somebody gets in prison, at least at the federal level. So it helped with certainty, but it was found to be unconstitutional because it didn't take into account mitigating factors. So we're back to legislature setting minimums and maximums, and the Sentencing Commission is making recommendations, right? So they don't have to be followed anymore. They're just recommendations. And if you give somebody a sentence within the recommendations, it's presumptively constitutional. Now, the last one that gets to us is a big problem in the United States is swiftness of punishment, right? So if you wanted the death penalty to be severe or effective, as soon as a person is sentenced, you'd walk them outside and you'd hang them or electrocute them or whatever you would do to them. But that's not in keeping with due process, right? So remember, we're in this struggle between individual rights and the safety of the community. So we're not swift. When it comes to imprisonment, We are a little bit better, but generally speaking, you'll sit in jail for maybe a year before you'll go to the actual prison, but your liberty is taken away. So swiftness and punishment, that is true for incarceration and virtually only incarceration. Even then, if it's a minor offense, you can basically ask the judge to let you stay free, give you basically another form of bail before while you're appealing your sentence, right? And that's why the process is not swift, because we have an appellate process that is multi-tiered and involves generally two sovereigns, right? And the idea here is we want to make sure that we are not putting the wrong people in jail. We're not executing the wrong people, like we're doing the right thing. Now there's a problem. On appeal, you cannot say that you are innocent. You've already been convicted. So the court considers you guilty. What you're doing on appeal is you're making legal arguments that your lawyer wasn't effective, or that your constitutional rights were violated when this happened, or this piece of evidence should have been suppressed. Right? If that happens, then it gets sent back to the trial court for a new trial. So that being said, we see the most appeals in death penalty cases. So in death penalty cases, you generally get an automatic appeal to the state Supreme Court, right? The rationale is you're going to go to the Court of Appeals anyway, and then you're going to the Supreme Court. So like, you might as well just go to the Supreme Court of the state. From there, we'll talk about habeas corpus. Then you can enter the federal system and challenge your conviction all the way through the federal system. And if you're facing death, why wouldn't you, right? Why wouldn't you try everything that you possibly could to slow the death penalty? That being said, I was reading something this morning that for the first time since 1953, the federal government is executing a woman. She'll be executed here in the next couple of weeks. And she had probably been on death row, I was trying to remember what it was, 20 or 30 years, right? And it's just because these appeals take so long to play out, but that person also wants to like fight for their life. So we're not exactly swift when it comes to like the most severe. When it comes to imprisonment, we are swift, but we hide prisons away, right? So people can't see them. So people can't like, oh, wow, that could happen to me. So we don't do it in the best way. But you know, there's always room for improvement, always room for change. Now, the one thing I wanted to get to was, remember, deterrence is predicated on rationality, right? So basically what we assume for deterrence is before you commit a crime, you sit down and you make a pros and cons list, right? And you have one side that says pros for committing the crime, and you have a side that says cons for committing the crime. And whichever one has the most or the most weight wins, right? So if you're rational, you would say, okay, I could break into this person's house and steal their TV, but that would give me imprisonment for 25 years if I got caught. A TV is not worth 25 years of my life. That is how we assume criminals or people commit crime. The thing is, people are not rational beings, right? We don't sit down and make lists. We do things out of impulse. And that's really hard to deter, right? Really hard to deter. Also, some crimes cannot be deterred at all, right? So think of passion killings. You come home from a long day at work, you hear giggling upstairs, laughing upstairs, whatever. You go up the stairs and you find your partner in bed with somebody else, right? And it's obvious from your preliminary examination that they had just finished having sex. So you kind of go into like this blind rage. You go for a gun on the nightstand, grab the gun and shoot and kill both of them, right? That is murder, right? Because you've broken the law. Now, the question is, could you ever deter that? The answer is usually probably not, right? That individual literally has lost their grasp of reality. They are so upset, they are so out of their mental state that they're not thinking, I'm going to get punished for this or anything like that. They're just thinking like, I'm on a white rage and I'm going to kill people. Like, I mean, it's just that notion. All right, so I always tell people, don't keep firearms in the bedroom. Now, some like could be deterred, right? So there's a famous case that we talk about in criminal law where guy basically he sees his lover in bed with somebody else, so he runs downstairs to his safe, his gun safe, and it's a combination safe. He puts in the combination the first time easily, grabs a gun, loads the gun, runs back upstairs, and shoots and kills both of them. In that instance, we said, yeah, he had time to cool down. Like if he wasn't rational, it wouldn't have been the first time opening a gun safe lock, right? I've always had trouble with padlocks. Always had trouble with padlocks because it's like left, right, left, past, yeah. But imagine that you are enraged and you have that kind of passion. Then we're talking there's a big problem, right? Because we can't deter that type of crime. So theoretically, most American sentencing philosophies focus on retribution and deterrence, right? Both specific and general. But we also have others that come into play. Rehabilitation, incapacitation, and restoration. So rehabilitation is the treatment underlying social causes of crime, including psychological disorders. So what this is this is really the hallmark of the Norwegian prison system. Because our goal in rehabilitation is to say, all right, you committed crime X. Why did you commit crime X? Right? Do you have a mental condition that's been undiagnosed? Were you just poor and you needed something so that you could eat or that you needed shelter? Why did you do what you did? And in Norway, generally speaking, the maximum sentence you can get is 20 years in prison. And it's kind of like a challenge, right? Of like, if we can't fix you in 20 years, I mean, there's options for like civil commitment after that, but their goal is let's get you fixed and make sure this doesn't happen again, right? So so Norway, the prison cells are much different. It's very much a dorm style, well, a suite style. There's like a shared kitchen and stuff like that. You have a key to your room, you have a private shower, you have a private computer, there's an Xbox in each room, in the great room, and there's like TVs and stuff like that. But you spend most of your day in programming. So like every day you visit the prison psychiatrist, every day you have therapy, every day you learn certain skills. Let's say you don't have certain job skills, you learn them. They pay somebody to come in and teach them. It's tremendous, right? And it always gets criticism for two reasons. And the two reasons blatantly are not true. The first is that people would offend just so that they could go to prison, right? If you're homeless, you could have a really nice place. Keep in mind that Scandinavian countries tend to be socialist. So this person, if they were homeless, they wouldn't be homeless. All you have to do is go down to the respective office and they would help you get into a home, right? So that's another one. And the second one is that it would be very, very expensive, right? Because in order to be a prison guard in Norway, you have to have at least a college degree in psychology, right? Because you don't have any weapons. Your words are your weapon. And so the argument is, well, if they're trying to fix them, you're trying to do all this stuff, you're rewarding them and it costs more money. Well, one, it's not a reward because they're still in prison, like they can't leave, go home. Now, if they are the primary caregiver, their family can come stay with them in a special area. So they still have contact and things like that, but the family can come and go, but the incarcerated person cannot, right? And they don't get to see their friends and stuff like that. So there is punishment. And as to the expense issue, Norway spends a lot less. When I say a lot, I mean a lot less per capita on prisons than the United States does. Right, so the United States, in order to house somebody who's under the age of 65, it costs between $20,000 and $25,000 a year. To house somebody who's over the age of 65, estimates say it costs between $75,000 and $100,000 a year to house them. Keep in mind, that's your tax dollars, right? You're spending $100,000 on maybe somebody who committed a relatively minor crime, right? So you kind of think about, like, where is your money going? Norway, yes, they do have a high tax rate, but you get things for it, right? Healthcare is free. If you make a mistake, you go to prison. We help you fix that mistake and help you become a good citizen. I mean, it's so different. It's a different culture and a different perspective. So rehabilitation is, again, Norway's kind of big thing. And what it does is it actually focuses on reducing recidivism. And remember, recidivism is committing another crime after you've committed the first crime, right, once you get out. And they have a great success record. In fact, Norway has one of the lowest recidivism rates in the world. Guess who has the highest recidivism rate in the world? The United States, right? So it's clear we're not doing something right. And maybe it's time to look to other countries to see what they're doing and try that ourselves. And we are seeing that in some states. So there's a news article that I posted to the site about South Dakota. South Dakota is trying to implement a version, not the full version, but a version, a softer version of the Norwegian prison system, right, where they focus on helping people and things like that. Because they're like, well, if it's cheaper and it's more effective, why wouldn't we do it? Now, this is South Dakota. Keep in mind, only 2 people live there. But it's a start, right? Because other states are looking at South Dakota saying, how much is this costing you? Right? Because we always want lowest amount. And is it actually working? So South Dakota just adopted this. We will see how it turns out. But we are starting to see states, the feds haven't moved, but states looking abroad going, oh, look, keep putting people in prison is ridiculously expensive for a lot of crimes that are just minor, and it doesn't help them. Because when you get out, I mean, think about the United States. When you get out, you have a criminal record. You can't get a job, right? You can't find housing. So guess what you're going to do? You're going to reoffend so that you can at least have housing. Norway is much different. Like when you leave with a college degree and you leave with a job that you can do that would support your family. It's such a different world, which you kind of at first go, wow, this person's being rewarded. But again, keep in mind, they're not. They can't go see their friends. They can't interact. And that's the only thing that we're supposed to take away is a person's liberty, right? Their freedom of movement. And in the United States, that's the theory too. It's not true, but it's the theory. And in Norway, yeah, they take away your freedom of movement. You can't just come and go as you please and things like that. But they try to make you a citizen. And again, you get technology, you get computers, because think about prisoners who get out now who've been in there for 20 years. Every job requires you to use a computer. How do they don't even know how the internet works, right? So this is a big stark difference. If you take my comparative class, we spend a lot of time looking at Norway, the United States, China, Japan, and then we get into Sharia law quite a bit. So if you're interested in that, take that course. Another philosophy, and again, this is what we also use in the United States, is incapacitation, right? So incapacitation basically is we're just pulling the offender out of society. Like, we don't care if the offender is like recidivates. We don't care if the offender commits another crime. We're just removing them from society. Right? So like, if they're not in society, they can't commit crimes and you don't have to deal with them. This has limited statistical support because incapacitation works to a certain degree, but after a certain period, it's more harmful than it is beneficial, right? So we see people who come out of prison and they go out and they commit much more violent crimes. Largely it's because they've been incapacitated, they've been removed from society. Now they're back in society with no skills, nothing like that, and they have a chip on their shoulder because they were in there too long, right? So incapacitation has its problems. Then we have restoration, right? Restoration is interesting. Restoration, there's a whole process and a whole theory based upon this called restorative justice. So restorative justice is premised on the belief that crime is, quote, primarily a conflict between individuals, end quote. And the role of the justice system is to repair injuries through peace, right? So what's interesting is what we're trying to do here is we're trying to say, we're looking and saying, okay, if you go and smash a window of a store downtown and we put you in jail, that person still has to replace that window. Like, that person has that money out like that. You being in jail does nothing for them. Restoration says, no. You're not going to jail. You're going to fix the window, or you're going to pay for it and you're going to fix it. It's done in a peaceful manner where we don't emphasize violence or anything along those lines. And what we do is we actually put an active role on the defendant, the defender, the victim, and the community. And what happens a lot of times is they come together, and usually it's called a peace circle, where the offender sits in one spot, and then the victim and the community members come, they sit around him. And they share with the offender what exactly that person's actions did to them, right? And the idea is to help that offender understand, like, oh, wow, I didn't realize this, right? Like, you go through the peace circle and the victim says, yeah, I know that you think you just broke a window, but our store is really struggling. And to replace the window is going to cost $500 that we just don't have. We might have to close down because of this. Then you're like, holy crap, right? Like, the offender at that point is, I mean, unless they are a sociopath, probably feels terrible. And then the community gets to weigh in and say, well, yeah, you made me feel less safe living in my home because you broke windows and maybe were robbing people or whatever. And so they go around the peace circle, and the last person to talk is the offender. And the offender usually apologizes like crazy, is crying, means it, because it is such a meaningful process of let's come together and talk about what happened. Then the offender is either sentenced or they agree in the peace circle to what the offender is going to do to restore the victim, right? So you're going to replace the window, right? You're going to work and you're going to get a job, and so much of that money is going to go to replacing the window, and you're going to replace the window. That's a lot easier to do with property crimes. Not so much when it comes to violent offenses. Right? Actually, the most violent offense, and think like a homicide, this could work in terms of like the peace circle. But other crimes, think of, I hate to always go to this one, but think of rape. You probably, if you have been the victim of a sexual assault, probably don't want to sit in the same room as an offender. So those are a little bit more difficult, a little bit more challenging. Also, how do you restore somebody, right? If it comes down to you hurt somebody physically, maybe you have to work to pay their medical bills, or you have to work to pay their counseling ongoing, whatever it is. You have to do something, right? The emphasis here is not on negative shaming, it's on positive shaming. And so what it means by that is, when we think of negative shaming comes into play in the United States, right? If you go to prison and you get out, you are labeled an ex-con, right? And every job application is going to ask you to check the box. Now, certain cities have banned it. So Boston has banned the check the box, asking if you've ever been convicted of a crime. It's illegal to ask that in Boston. You can ask that, but only if you are going to make them an offer of employment. And the idea is, by then you've gotten to know them and you are giving them a chance to explain what happened and how you've grown because of it, right? So that being said, with the exception of Boston and a couple other places, most places, they have the check the box, and you have to say for the rest of your life, you are an ex-con, right? So good luck getting a job, good luck getting a house. And if you're an ex-con, nobody's going to support you, and nobody's going to say, well, let's reach out to this person and lift them up. No, nobody's going to, right? Because nobody even sees you as a human being anymore in the United States. We see you as an ex-con, someone that basically is less than us. Restoration, we say, no, people are equal. We don't want this person to leave with this moniker of being an ex-offender or whatever. We want them to leave going, okay, that was a positive experience, right? Yes, it was really hard emotionally, but I understand now what I did, the full consequences of what I did, and now I know how to fix it, right? And again, this is useful in most crimes. I mean, there's some that's not the greatest in, but it's one that I really like because it actually helps restore the victim. The victim gets a say. The offender can apologize to the victim. I mean, it's a very, very moving process to be a part of. I'm also part of one in Boston, and wow, was it powerful. Basically in Boston, it was a kid, and the kid was caught shoplifting, right? And when they kind of went to his car, he had tons and tons of merchandise from other stores in the mall. So they divert the case to a peace circle. And so I'm a member of the community, and I was studying it at the time. And then we had some of the shopkeepers there, the offender was there, and we all sat down in a circle and we had a talking piece, right? So it was like a little stone. And when you had the stone, you could talk for as long as you want without being interrupted, and talk about anything that you want. The idea is you're going to be talking about what the offense is, right? So whoever starts the circle sits next to the offender and make sure that they pass the talking piece around in such a way that the offender has to go last, right? And so it was interesting because you have these shopkeepers who say, yeah, you think that you robbed from a really big company, but we just use their name. Right? It comes out of our paychecks. And it was just, I mean, it was amazing. Like halfway through, this kid is bawling his eyes out for a minor crime of shoplifting, right? And so the victims each got to say like what they want to happen to him or what he needs to do to make them whole, right? And granted, they got all their merchandise returned. It was really interesting because the last vendor to go, the last person to go, actually made the kid a job offer, right? Said, you know, I forgive you. We got the merchandise back, right? You're a kid. I understand it. It seems like you need money. You can come work for me. And at that point, I started crying because like it was just so emotional. And the offender, the kid was, I mean, he was broken down. He was like not coming out. He was emotionally destroyed, but in a very positive way, right? And so he came out of it knowing the consequences of what he did, how it made people feel, but he also came out of it with a job, and he came out of it in a way that restored people back to where they were before he decided to do what he did. So that's restoration. It's a really, really cool policy. Different states have different rules regarding restoration. There's no state that has like a very perfect form of it. Some states will do minor stuff, will go to restoration, but that's kind of about it. It's something that we should definitely explore more as a country. So we talked a little bit about this before, but using the philosophies that we have, how do we create sentencing options? Well, sentencing is supposed to reflect the separation of powers. Right? So the legislative branch creates sentencing options in criminal codes. Now, this may include either intermediate sentences, or excuse me, indeterminate sentences or determinate sentences. An indeterminate sentence is the judge has discretion and can sentence you to a range. A determinate sentence is you commit crime X, you go to jail for 15 years. You commit crime Y, you go to jail for 10 years, right? Like you know going in what's at stake. So that's the legislative branch. Now the judicial branch, they apply the codes as written. Now traditionally, they did get some, they had a lot of discretion. And then we moved away from that to you have to follow the US sentencing guidelines, to where we're at today is you have to start with the US sentencing guidelines, right, which is just a chart in which we calculate the severity of the offense, and it gets a number. Every offense under the federal law has a number, and we calculate your criminal history, right? And we are on a graph, and we just match the two, where the two meet. And that's the range of sentences that you can get. And then the judge can sentence you to anything in between in that range. Now the judge can also now go above the range, which is always subject to appeal. Or the judge, if they're like, this is ridiculous, or this is not what this is supposed to be, can go lower than the guidelines, but they have to provide written reasons why, right? So they get some discretion, but if they go too far, they have to give written reasons, and that's subject to appeals. And then the executive branch comes into play because the executive branch actually carries out the sentence as ordered by the judicial branch via the Department of Corrections, right? So that being said, the executive branch may impact sentencing via things like determinations, parole, good time, and pardons. And so what we're meaning by this is if we think about a determination, it depends on the state that you're in, but let's say you are in, let's say Massachusetts, the one I know best. you commit a sex offense, right? You are on the sex offender registry. Now, you can appeal to get off the sex offender registry after a certain number of years, but when you are given over to the Department of Corrections, right, the executive branch, they make a determination of how dangerous you are, right? So you could have like level, I forget which order it goes in, but a level 1 offender, right, who's just like, they had child porn, which is not good by any means, but it's not rape. I mean, there's still victimization, absolutely, but it's not something like sexual assault, which is a little bit different, right? And what they do is they say, okay, none of these people are good people, so let's rank them on like how dangerous they can be when they get out. And in Massachusetts, only the 2 most dangerous classes, I think it's a 4 and a 5, are known to the public, right? And only disclosed to the public. So like you can go on the website and look at their pictures and stuff like that. Whereas Missouri, they don't do classes. They just, you're a sex offender, your picture goes up on a website. Massachusetts, only 4 and 5s. Now, this changed partly because a man was riding in the subway, noticed another man sitting in the subway car, recognized him as a sex offender, shot him and killed him. Right? And that's when we said, hey, the sex offender registry might not be the best idea. So that's why they only put the most dangerous ones out there, ones that like they are pretty sure are going to commit another crime. That's their determination. And they put the ones who are less dangerous, they keep them out of public view. And the idea is that way they can maybe get a job, they can live life, etc. So they make determinations. The executive branch also engages in parole. Parole is basically you've served so much of your sentence, usually in like Georgia, I think it's like 85%. You've served 85% of your sentence. For the remainder of your sentence, we are going to allow you to go into the community. Now, you have a parole officer. You have to check in with that parole officer so many times. You have to do drug testing, blah, 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 blah. But we're going to let you out of prison early. That being said, the reason I referenced Georgia is because it's one of the highest states in terms of how much of your sentence you have to fulfill. It's 85%. So, I mean, you only get 15% of your sentence outside of jail. So it's really important. But also parole is interesting because the federal system, the feds, abolished parole. There is no more parole in the federal system. Instead, what happens is you get good time. We'll talk about what good time is in a minute. And you get probation. So you'll serve a sentence for 5 years. And then when you get out, you're on probation for 5 years. Right? Originally, they were probably going to send you to 10, but said they'd do 5 and 5. Or they could do 5 and 1. It really depends on what the judicial branch says, what the legislative branch says, etc. Now, good time, again, this is really important in the feds, basically says for every day that you are in jail or you're in prison and you do not commit another offense, or you behave, right? You're not violent, you're not stabbing people, you behave, you follow the rules, everything that you're told to do, you do, you earn extra credit, right? So you might get a day might be a day and a fourth, right? So after 4 days of being good, you have an extra day, right? Instead of having 5th day, it's now your 6th day. So you can rack those up, especially if you have a long sentence. If you have a long sentence, you want to be good because good time's going to get you out years early. That being said, they also use good time as kind of a weapon that hang over people's heads because good time can be taken away, right? It can be lessened, whatever. So if you are violating a rule and you go before a hearing, usually before the warden of the prison, the warden can say, you know what? I'm taking away 45 days of your good time. And like, that's huge, because that's 45 days a person could have been out. So good time is definitely used a lot. And then of course the executive branch can grant pardons. So it's only the chief executive who can grant the pardons. So at the federal level, if it's a federal offense, only the president can grant a pardon. If it's at the state level, a state offense, only the governor can grant a pardon. And what we normally see is, because pardons are very unpopular, because people don't read things, they don't research things, is usually somebody, the governor is outgoing, like the governor's outgoing or the president is outgoing, and they pardon just a ridiculous number of people, right? Because they get pardon requests all the time, and then they make decisions. But they do it when they're leaving, because they wouldn't get reelected if they granted all those pardons. That being said, President Obama did grant pardons to like 2,500 people in federal prison for drug offenses, which is huge. It was either a pardon or commutation, but he basically just let him out of prison. And he did that in the middle of his term, which is huge, because you don't do that in the middle of your term, right? You do that when you're leaving. But yeah, it turned out fairly well. But I think we'll see moving on in the future, criminal justice reform is going to be a big topic, but I still think we're going to see governors and presidents only pardoning people as they leave office. Like, and literally, it's like the last day of their thing that they'll do of the pardons. So, what sentencing options do we have in the United States? So, the current constitutional sentencing options, the one that we go to probably the second most is imprisonment, incarceration. It's the go-to option. It creates harsh conditions. There's overcrowded facilities, largely by the Get Tough movement. There's a case I have referenced for you here, United States v. Bailey. Bailey was in a prison that was so bad, he felt the need to escape. So he escapes, writes a letter to the warden, writes a letter to the governor, writes a letter to the newspaper saying, I will return as soon as the conditions are made better. As soon as they're safe, I'll surrender. Ultimately, like, he gets picked up, and the Supreme Court says, well, you can escape if you're in immediate danger, but as soon as that danger passes, you have to turn yourself back in. Which is what Bailey offered to do, but the Supreme Court was like, we're not going to make the conditions nice for you. It's not going to be a pleasant experience. But if you're safe, that's what counts. But that being said, prisons are definitely not safe places. And again, we have a weird system. Ours is really, really, really harsh in terms of confinement, when people eat, how long they have to eat, rec time, all that stuff. It's really, really harsh. Other countries look at us and say, whoa, like they would say that that is a violation of the Eighth Amendment. Like our imprisonment, the violation of our own Eighth Amendment. But we've held that it's not, that what we do is perfectly fine. Then we have another option, which are intermediate sanctions. Right, so intermediate sanctions, basically a wide variety of options based upon need for control and rehabilitation. Right, so this is what we're talking about. We want this person to be rehabilitated, but we also want them to we want to have control over them, right? We want to control what they do, but they can be out in the public. We control what they do, and they have to meet certain criteria. So for instance, one of the criteria could be community service, right? That's symbolic restitution. You are working somewhere and you're doing it for free to help a nonprofit, that's community service, right? And we might say you have to do 2,000 hours of community service. Now, where I grew up in Lebanon, Missouri, people who got community service, there was a wait list for the airport in Lebanon, Missouri. Because unlike up here where like little airports, they're like Delta and big name companies fly from all the time. Lebanon, like it was like private planes. Like that was it. If you only like fly in the airport. Like there was actually a big newspaper article when one of those giant military planes that has the like the giant cargo bay, it had to make an emergency landing, and the whole newspaper article was about how the runway was long enough and how the runway did this and this and this. Like not anything about the emergency, but talking about the airport and the runway. But there was a wait list because you could volunteer your community service hours at the airport. Now, what did that involve? That involved as soon as you came in, you vacuumed the floors, and then you sat down in the tower and you watched the traffic controllers do their job. That was it. But they counted that as community service. So like, it's not as bad as some people make it out to be. Now there is intensive supervision probation. So this is where your probation officer, you meet with that probation officer daily. That probation officer can come to your house at any time, can search your house at any time, right? Your rights are suspended. They don't need a warrant. It's very intense. We also we don't do this as much because people think it's rewarding, but after COVID, I think we might see it more because COVID has driven everybody nuts, is home detention, right, with electronic monitoring. So basically, we're sentencing you to 2 years in your home. You got to wear a little bracelet that tells us that you're in your home. Like, we just spent 5 months in our home and has not been good on our mental health, sanity, happiness, anything, right? Like nothing really as good has become of it. So imagine doing that for 2 years, not being able to leave your home. Like that's a lot more intense than maybe we thought it was before. Right, so before COVID, we probably thought home detention, wait, I don't have to leave my home for 2 years. I'm just gonna watch TV for 2 years. And then we realized like, holy crap, we can't do it for 6 months, right? It's terrible. Better than prison, but like still friggin' awful. So that's kind of where we're talking about. I think we might see some changes in home detention in terms of people getting sentenced to it maybe more than in prison. Because one, it's cheaper, and two, it's more harsh. Boot camps. So these are not necessarily affiliated with the military, but they are run like military boot camps, right? Where you have to, spit shine your shoes. You get yelled at by the drill sergeant. You have to do all this stuff. And the idea behind boot camps originally was one way that you could get out of jail, and this was like World War II. One way you can get out of jail time is by volunteering for the Army, right? So if you volunteer for the Army, the idea was they will fix you, and like you'll probably get killed, but like they'll fix you, and they'll fix you via boot camp. So what we would do is we'd send them to boot camp, and then from there they would have to enlist and go into the Army and do whatever they had to do. Now that's changed, right? Now we just have boot camp. So we basically send you to a boot camp that's the exact same as an Army boot camp. But in this boot camp, when you're done, you're done. The military now doesn't let felons, unless there's like a really good case for them, into the Army. Like you can't get into the military. So that's where boot camp kind of comes into play as a problem. We also have shock incarceration, or also known as shock probation. And what this means is you get probation, but we're going to make you spend 2 weekends in jail, right? So like you show up on a Friday and they do all the stuff that they do to prisoners on the intake. And then Sunday you get to leave, you do your job, you come back the next Friday, stay in prison and jail for like the 2 days, and then Sunday you come back. And the idea is to scare the hell out of you, right? To be like, whoa, I don't want to be here. I need to change what I'm doing. Like, this really sucks. That being said, when we're talking about like shock incarceration with juveniles, it really does not work at all. So, you know, you've seen those, I mean, they have all kinds of TV shows where, you know, the kids go in and the inmates are screaming at them, and, you know, it's just, one, it's not realistic, and two, like, the kids know it's not realistic, right? It's a lot different. So it doesn't do much for the kids, but it does do something for adults. Where we're like, wow, I'm not doing this again. Like, I'm not coming back here. I've been here 4 days and I'm miserable. I can't do this. Then we also have what's called SIS, Suspended Imposition of Sentence. And so for SIS, basically we say, I'm sentencing you to 2 years suspended. So what does that mean? That means you have 2 years, or that means for the next 2 years, you have 2 years of prison hanging over your head. All right, so if you mess up at all, and you get arrested, you are automatically sent to prison for 2 years, and then you have a trial and a new hearing and imprisonment for your new offense. Now, it could be literally the last day of the 2 years, and you commit an offense the last day. You still have to do the full 2 years, and then whatever you would get as a punishment. Right? So SIS seems like it's like a nice way out, but it's actually a really crappy way out. Because if you mess up at all, you lose. Last thing I'll talk about today, and we'll get into this more in next class, is probation. So probation, the idea, actually originated in Boston in 1841 by a shoemaker. He made shoes. He came up with this idea. And the idea was, like, for low-level first-time offenders, we're going to say, yes, you messed up. You're on our radar now. Here are some conditions that you have to fulfill. Right? You have to go for drug testing or something like that. But, you know, you're free to go out in the community. It's kind of a mulligan, right? And what we have today is, generally speaking, like, you get 2 freebies. Like, if you commit crimes, as long as they're relatively minor, like murder, you're not going to get probation. But commit relatively minor crimes, your first and second one, you're probably going to get probation. At your third one, that's when we're looking at jail time. Now, I'm not telling you this so that you go out and commit crimes, but just kind of having a concept of, wow, our system is so messed up, so broken, that people can commit crimes twice and still just go back out to the community. Because we're more concerned with all the serious crime that we deal with, right? Minor crimes are just like, just probation, go away. Like, I don't care. Serious crimes, that's what we deal with. And we don't want basically the non-serious crimes clogging the system for the serious crimes. So that being said, next class we'll look at other sentencing options and we will move on from there. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I hope you have a great day.